13. The bishop asked me one question about my marriage. My husband answered for me. I was 31 years old the morning Bishop Amos called us into study. The room smelled of wood oil and old paper. There was one window, and the light coming through it was the pale, watery kind that belongs to early March, when winter has not finished, but everyone has grown tired of pretending they are not tired of it. I remember the two chairs set side by side in front of his desk. I remember that my husband, Eli, pulled his chair slightly forward when we sat down, so that his shoulder crossed in front of mine by just a few inches. At the time I told myself it was nothing, a habit. The way a man settles into a seat. Bishop Amos folded his hands on the desk, looked at me, nodded Eli at me and asked his question. Sarah, he said, are you content in your marriage? 4 words meant for me. 4 words I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone in authority to direct at me alone for the better part of 6 years. I opened my mouth. Eli answered. I am going to tell you everything that led to that moment, but I want you to understand something first. When I opened my mouth in that study, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I had the words. They were sitting right there, behind my teeth, fully formed and ready. That is the part that has never left me. Not that I was silenced, but that I was silenced at the precise moment I had finally decided not to be. To explain how I came to be sitting in that chair, I have to go back to the autumn I was 22 years old, and to the evening my father told me that Eli Brenneman had asked to come calling. I grew up in a district in eastern Ohio, in a community that had been established by my great-grandfather's generation. We were not a large settlement, perhaps 40 families. Ple and we lived close enough to one another that privacy was less a right, and more a courtesy. People occasionally extended when they remembered to. My father, Jonas, was a deacon. My mother, Ruth, was the kind of woman who said very little in public and managed almost everything in private. She was not warm in an obvious way, but she was consistent, and for most of my childhood I confused consistency with safety. I was the second of 4 children, the oldest daughter. I had learned early that in our household, the way to avoid friction was to be useful and be quiet. I was good at both. Eli Brenneman was 28 when he came to our door that first evening. He was tall, with the kind of steady, the measured way of moving that people in our community mistook for gentleness. He worked his family's farm on the far edge of our district, property that had been in the Brenneman family for 3 generations. He was considered a serious man. Responsible. Well regarded by Bishop Amos, who had confirmed Eli's baptism himself and spoke of him with the particular approval that passes between older men when they recognize that a younger one will not cause them trouble. That should have meant something to me. It did not. My mother sat with us for the first 2 visits, as was expected. On the 3rd visit she excused herself to the kitchen and stayed there for the duration. I remember the sound of her setting down a cast-iron pot on the stovetop, deliberate, unhurried, as though she had made a decision and was comfortable with it. Eli and I talked about ordinary things, the harvest, the community, his plans for a new section of fence along the north field. He asked me questions, and I answered them, and at the time I believed this was courtship, 2 people learning each other. What I did not notice then, and only began to understand much later, was that Eli never sat with my answers. He would ask, and while I was still speaking, something behind his eyes would settle into a kind of patience that was not really patience at all. It was waiting. He was waiting for me to finish so that he could tell me what he thought about what I had said. I was 22. I thought that was how conversation worked between a man and a woman in our world. We were published in November and married that December. In the first cold snap of the year, on a Thursday morning in the home of my parents, I wore my good blue dress and a white apron. My younger sister, the Martha, stood beside me. I remember that my hands were cold and that I pressed them flat against my apron during the service to hide that they were trembling. Bishop Amos performed the ceremony. He spoke about the covenant of marriage, about submission and care, about the husband as the head of the household and the wife as his helpmate. These were not words I had never heard. They were the same words I had grown up breathing. I did not flinch at them. I folded them into myself the same way I had folded everything else I had been taught to carry quietly. When it was finished, Eli took my hands in both of his, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. We moved into the farmhouse in the first week of January. It was a good house, solid and clean, and I set about making it function the way I had been raised to make a home function. I cooked, I preserved. I kept the accounts in the household ledger that Eli kept on the shelf above the kitchen table. Kept on the shelf, I said. Within 3 months of our marriage, the ledger moved from the shelf above the kitchen table to the desk in the room Eli used for correspondence. He did not explain the move. When I asked about a particular expense I could not find recorded, he told me he had taken over the accounts. That he would handle it. That I had enough to manage with the house. It was said without anger. That was the thing I could never quite hold on to early in my marriage. Eli rarely raised his voice. He simply arranged things, quietly, methodically, and always with a reason that sounded, if you said it to another person, entirely sensible. He handled the accounts. He spoke to the feed suppliers when they came to the door. He relayed messages from the bishop's announcements at church, though I sat 20 feet away and had heard every word myself, when our neighbor, Drusilla Yoder, stopped by one afternoon to ask whether I would join the women in preparing food for an upcoming gathering. Eli appeared in the doorway behind me and said I was needed at home that week. I was not needed at home that week, but Drusilla nodded and went home. And I stood in the kitchen doorway watching her go, and I told myself that Eli was protective. This was what it looked like when a man took seriously his responsibility for his household. I told myself many things in those early years. The first time I tried to speak directly to my concern, we had been married for about 14 months. I waited until a Sunday evening when supper was finished and the kitchen was clean, and there was no task I was supposed to be completing. I sat down across from Eli at the table, and I told him as carefully as I could arrange the words, that I sometimes felt as though my voice was not present in our home. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "You are present in this home every day, Sarah." I said that was not what I meant. He said, "A home does not require two people to be speaking at the same time. That is not harmony, that is noise." He said it gently. And then he opened the Bible that he kept at the table's edge, and he read for the remainder of the evening, and the conversation was finished. I washed the lamp chimneys that night, one by one, holding each one up to check for smudges. My hands were steady by then. I had learned, somewhere in those 14 months, to keep them steady. By our 3rd year, I had stopped expecting certain things. I had stopped expecting to speak first when someone came to the door. I had stopped expecting to finish a sentence in the presence of others without Eli completing it. I had stopped expecting to know the contents of a letter addressed to our household before Eli had read it and decided what to share. These are small things, listed plainly. I know how they sound. I also know that when you live inside them, when they accumulate the way sediment accumulates, silently and without drama, they do not feel small. They feel like the weather. You do not argue with the weather, you dress for it. I did have one place that remained my own. It was a practice more than a place, I suppose. Each evening after Eli went to bed, I would sit alone at the kitchen table for perhaps 20 minutes with a cup of weak tea, and I would think my own thoughts without managing them for one's comfort. I did not write them down. I had learned early that written things in our household had a way of being found, but I held them, those thoughts, and I tended them, and they were mine. It was during one of those evenings in our 4th year of marriage that I first allowed myself to think a thought I had been keeping at a distance for a long time. I thought, I do not know if Eli has ever heard me. Not misheard, not disagreed with, simply heard, received a thing I said as something originating from my own interior, something that existed before he decided what it meant or whether it mattered. I folded the thought back up and drank my tea and went to bed. But it was different after that evening. I knew I had thought it, and knowing changes things whether or not you act on it. The marriage review was not unusual in our district. Every few years, Bishop Amos made a point of meeting with married couples, together, and sometimes separately, to assess the spiritual health of the household. It was framed as pastoral care. Most couples I knew treated it as a routine thing, a brief conversation, a chance to receive the bishop's blessing and move along. Eli mentioned our scheduled meeting with Bishop Amos on a Wednesday evening. He said it the way he said most things that were already decided, not as information being shared but as a fact being deposited. "We meet with Amos on Friday morning," he said. "Wear your good dress." Something changed in me when he said that, not dramatically, not visibly. But there was a small, quiet shifting, the way ice shifts on a river in the first days of thaw. I do not know exactly why that particular sentence was the one that reached me. Perhaps it was the dress, the assumption that I would present myself according to his instruction, even in a meeting called to assess the well-being of our marriage. That evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I made a decision. If Bishop Amos asked me a direct question, I would answer it myself. It sounds like such a small thing to have to decide, I know that. But for me, in that kitchen, in that life, it was not small. It was the largest decision I had made in 6 years. We arrived at Bishop Amos's home on Friday morning. His wife Edna let us in and offered coffee, which Eli accepted on behalf of us both. I did not correct him, I was saving myself. The bishop's study was at the back of the house. I described it to you at the beginning. The wood oil and old paper, the pale March light, the 2 chairs set side by side. What I did not tell you yet is that I noticed when we sat down that Bishop Amos had placed a small amount of space between those chairs, not much. Perhaps 6 inches, but it was deliberate. He had set the chairs so that Eli and I were near each other but distinct, 2 separate people, 2 separate seats. He spoke first about the farm, about the community, about the winter's difficulty. Eli answered. I sat with my hands in my lap and I breathed slowly and I waited. And then Bishop Amos looked at me, not at Eli, at me. He said, Sarah, are you content in your marriage? I opened my mouth and Eli said, she is, Bishop. She has been a faithful wife. We are in good order. The room stayed exactly as it was, the pale light through the window, the smell of old paper. Bishop Amos's hands folded on the desk. Something had shifted and I could feel it. Not in the room but in the bishop's face. He had watched me open my mouth. He had seen the moment my husband's voice entered the space where mine should have been, and he did not look away from me. He held my eyes for just a moment longer than was comfortable, and in that moment something passed between us that Eli could not have anticipated and could not control, because Bishop Amos said, I appreciate that, Eli, but I was asking Sarah. The silence that followed was unlike any I had experienced in that house or in my marriage. It was not the silence Eli used to close conversations. It was not the silence of compliance or exhaustion. It was the silence of something cracking open along a seam that had been sealed for a very long time. Eli did not speak again, and I found that the words I had prepared were still there, exactly where I had left them. I said, I have been obedient in my marriage, Bishop. I am not certain that is the same thing as content. I will not tell you that the meeting in Bishop Amos's study resolved everything. It did not. There are no tidy endings in stories that are built the way mine was built, layer by careful layer across years. But I will tell you what happened in the days and weeks that followed. Bishop Amos requested a second meeting. This time, he asked to speak with me alone. Eli sat in the front room with Edna while I went into the study by myself and sat in one of those chairs and talked to the bishop for nearly an hour. I told him what I have told you. The accounts moved to the desk, the messages relayed from across the room. The letter read and filtered. The question answered before the breath could leave my body. I told him about the evenings at the kitchen table with my cup of tea, and the thought I had allowed myself in our 4th year, and the decision I had made on the Wednesday night Eli told me to wear my good dress. Bishop Amos listened in a way I had not experienced from a man in authority in a very long time. He did not interrupt, he did not reframe. He did not look at me with the particular expression men in our district sometimes used when a woman was speaking at length, that faint, patient tension that said the words were being tolerated rather than received. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sarah, a man who answers for his wife when she has not asked him to has not protected her. He has replaced her. I have carried those words with me for 18 years. What followed was not simple and not fast. Eli did not transform. Bishop Amos did not remove him from the community or strip him of standing. These things do not happen quickly in a world built on patience and procedure and the preservation of community order. I understood that, even if I wished for a time that it were otherwise. What did happen was that Bishop Amos made it known, gently, through the slow channels of pastoral influence, that there were concerns about the Brenneman household, that the meeting had not concluded as expected, that a follow-up process had been initiated. In a community of 40 families, carried weight without requiring announcement. Eli was, for a period of months, a man who had been quietly observed and found wanting. I do not take satisfaction in saying that, but I do not pretend it meant nothing. More importantly, something had changed in me that could not be changed back. I had spoken, in the room where it mattered most, with the person who held the authority to hear it. I had used my own voice to say a true thing about my own life. Eli had tried to fill the space before my words arrived, the same way he had filled every space for 6 years, and for the first time, space had been held open for me by someone with the standing to hold it. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything. Eli and I did not remain married. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters for the truth of this story. We separated over the following year in the way that separations happen in closed communities, gradually, formally, painfully, with much discussion and little privacy, and an enormous amount of institutional gravity pressing in from every direction. There were people who believed I had shamed my family. There were people who believed I had been right to speak. There were people who had watched Eli answer for me in public settings for years and had never said a word, who found it easier to hold me responsible for the rupture than to examine their own silence. My mother was one of the last people I spoke to before I left the district. She was standing at her kitchen counter when I came to say goodbye, and she did not turn around immediately. She kept working at what she was doing, kneading bread, her hands steady and practiced, and then she turned, and she looked at me for a long moment and she said, "I always knew you had the words, Sarah." I did not ask her why she had never told me so before. Some questions have answers you already know, and speaking them aloud does not make them easier to carry. I kissed her on the cheek and I walked out to the road. I am 49 years old now. I live in a small town in Indiana, not far from Amish country. Close enough that I sometimes hear buggies on the road in the early morning and feel something complicated move through me. Part grief, part gratitude, part something I have not found a clean name for yet. I think often about Bishop Amos's question. The way he directed it at me specifically, the 6 inches of space he had placed between those 2 chairs. I have wondered over the years whether he already knew something when he arranged that room. Whether someone had said something to him before we arrived. I will never know the answer to that, and I have made my peace with not knowing. What I know is this: he asked me if I was content. He used my name. He waited, and when my husband's voice arrived before mine, he did not accept it. He pushed the question back to the place where it belonged. 4 words meant for me. 4 words that my husband tried to answer, and for the first time in 6 years those 4 words waited. They waited for me. I have spent a long time understanding what that moment cost me to get to, and what it gave me when I arrived. The cost was years of silence, of evenings with weak tea and carefully tended thoughts, of hands kept deliberately still, while something essential in me pressed quietly against the walls of the life I was living. What it gave me was the knowledge, certain and permanent and mine, that I always had the answer. I had it the whole time. I simply needed one person in that room to make enough space for it to exist. The ledger Eli moved to his desk is still somewhere in that farmhouse, I suppose. The accounts I kept in the first 3 months of my marriage, before they were taken from me, were accurate. I never made an error. I checked.